Lobo, and I'm from Sydney, Australia. I'm the founding director of Onsite, and I will be talking about how objectivity and subjectivity in data makes a huge difference when thinking about the interpretations. I'll be looking at what context setting means when it comes to data analytics and how that impacts our insights. Great to be here today. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land that I'm on, which is in Sydney, Australia, and those are the Camaragal people. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. So, I'm thrilled to be here to talk about AI, and the intention of this talk is to, provide some thoughts and some provocations for you to explore some new framings with how we think about data and how we think about our modelings. So a little bit about the work that I do. The purpose of my work is to really support the interrelationships between people and society, and really think about the intention behind the design of technology and how that shapes the way we go about with our lives and where we're heading in the future. Some initial observations that I want to begin with, and I found these really surprising, actually. So I got this from a Deloitte report, and they surveyed a whole bunch of IT and business executives, and what was surprising to me was that something like 56% of organizations intend to or are already slowing down AI adoptions because of emerging concerns and risks. 1 in 5 of these companies routinely monitor and manage and improve the data quality as part of their formal data governance effort, and that seems surprisingly low to me. And this one was a real, a bit of a shock too, which is, only 9% of organizations actually believe that their data is accurate. And so, there are contexts around this, but I guess what I really want to do is explore, where these issues are coming from, and what does that say about the way we work with data and the way we think about our models and the robustness around those systems. So I'm going to try and take you on a journey. This is going to be something that I'd love you to sort of reflect on during the presentation, but also after this talk, because some of these concepts will be sort of coming up in the work that you do within whatever role you have, as long as you're working with data and the AI models. So something that I think a lot of people have been listening to in the media and in the public discourse and the dialogue has been around what are the benefits and costs associated with AI. And there are so many words around there that we are drowning in to some degree. Words like fairness, justice, inequality, accessibility, sustainability, accountability, transparency, explainability, bias, dignity, ethics, freedom. And while that might seem really overwhelming, what we're really interested in, or what I'd like you to think about, is the interrelationships between each of those and how they all sort of come together to form a picture of how we design technologies and how we think about AI for the benefit of our organizations and the benefit of society and our clients. And so I want to reframe this entire sort of backdrop. And I'm going to use this quote, which was spoken by some of our Indigenous people in Australia. And it's this: the ethics of the system are the intrinsic aim of the system, not an externally imposed restraint on commercial or other outcomes. Our cultures measure knowledge and shared outcomes, not individual accumulation. We reveal wisdom and not wealth. So I want you to sort of, keep that as a backdrop as we continue the rest of this presentation. And we will think about why is it important to have a whole sort of systems perspective when we are designing with AI in mind. But first, I want to sort of talk about harvesting data, and what does that mean in your particular organization and your experiences with harvesting data. So for me here, the meaning of words is really powerful, right? We have heard data described as being, the new oil, the new gold, the new currency. And those sorts of definitions, those sorts of sort of metaphors bring up images of extraction and to be able to consume that information, which is fine. But what that actually does is that it shapes the way we think about data, and it shapes the way we think not just about the data, but what we think we can do with that information. And the problem here is by thinking about data as being, an extractionist sort of asset, we disregard the interrelationships that are sort of around that information and that data. So I want to use a slightly different analogy here. I want to use the analogy of something that's organic, something that is in relationship with the world and the ecosystem around. So I'm going to use the analogy for the purpose of this presentation of an apple as being, data. So the big question here is, how do we understand the forest and the trees and, the insects and the animals and the birds and the reptiles in that forest, and all those interdependencies by looking at data, which are apples in this particular situation. And so what we do is we traditionally, we've harvested that data, sort of, harvested that apple. We sort of wash the apple, cleanse the data. Generally, we sort that data, or we go through some levels of processing around that data. And finally, we are able to consume that data to some purpose. Now, the problem with that is that that data has been extracted out of its ecosystem. And so the information that you can garner about the forest from that apple is somewhat limited, because by harvesting the apple, you have decontextualized that information. And so this is at the heart of what I would love to sort of explore with you today. And I really want to sort of touch on this quote that was put together by the Council for Big Data, Ethics and Society. And essentially what they say is that at the heart of big data's consequences is a change in the relationality. So the relationality of that data, flexibility, repurposing, so the intention behind that information, and the decontextualization of that data. And so the question I want to open up here is, how are we thinking about the data that we collect? Do we really understand the context around which that information has been extracted from? So moving on from data, and we know we've sort of had a bit of provocations around that, I now want to explore the limitations or the boundaries of our models and our AI algorithms. So I want to start off by, I've listed, five different areas where I think we need to be a bit more mindful about when we're designing AI algorithms or even doing any kind of data analytic modeling. And the first is this concept of abstraction. So essentially our models and our algorithms are abstractions of reality, abstractions of our real ecosystem. And I really want to tap into the quote by Alfred Korzybski, which was, the map is not the territory. And so when we create a model or we create an algorithm with a certain purpose in mind, really understanding the depth of where those maps don't actually meet reality is important, because again, it touches on the various contexts that we may be inadvertently ignoring. Moving on from abstractions, I want to talk about assumptions. And here's a bit of a story that I want to tell. So when I was a little girl, around the age of 9, I was taught in school, like many of you were, that the angles in a triangle sum to 180 degrees. But I actually had this orange in my hand, and when I drew a triangle on my orange, I had 2 right angle triangles. And so I was convinced, looking at that orange, that the angles of triangle did not add up to 180 degrees. Now, we all know that, that sort of, that is only really valid in Euclidean space. But to be really mindful of the assumptions and the implications of those assumptions when we extract insights from the models that we create is kind of important, right? Because it tells us not just what we know about that information, but it also tells us that we might be finding ourselves in really tricky situations when it comes to dealing with living systems and social systems. Moving on to limitations. So really understanding the limitations of your model, not just understanding it from a, this is where this applies, but also understanding the situations where it would fail and how it's going to fail and what does the failure actually imply. And from that to paradoxes. So this one was a lot of fun. Some of you might be aware of Bertrand Russell's paradox, or and the easiest example I can find is this sentence is false, which sort of gets you sort of thinking about the various levels of that paradox. And ultimately, what it's doing is, it's sort of comparing a Boolean, a true or false, with a sentence. So it's sort of mixing types. And Gregory Bateson, who was a famous anthropologist and cyberneticist, spent a lot of his time thinking about logical type errors, where we start making assumptions and generalizations without paying really close and rigorous attention to the logical types within those sets and what actually that means when we interpret things. And so I want to move to perception and information, and the different types of data. There's objective data and there's subjective data, and how do we work with each? What is our perception like with that information and the data that we collect? Whose information is that? Whose perception are we recording? And how is our world and our framing of our understanding of what's happening with that information being shaped by not just the data, but also the additional information that comes in? So how is our perception actually changing? And what does it mean when we talk about objective information and subjective data? So as an example, I could talk about objective data being, the number of felonies created, accounted for in a particular jurisdiction. Now, that may seem like objective information to you and I, because there's information that's been collected by the courts or the police and the legal system. But how do we then think about accounting for the systemic injustices in those systems and in those in our society that may have subjectivity built within those systems? So the data that we're collecting is objective, but the subjectivity then is sort of weaved into those systems. And so that's that's something I think we need to be a little bit more mindful of. Now, this is probably my parlor trick, and I love this example when I first read it. So I first discovered Gregory Bateson's work and his work around how the mind works and how we think about information, and what does information mean, and how do we sort of layer information to get better insights. And he gives this beautiful example where he says, okay, let's think about information. And if you sort of cover up one of your eyes and you sort of scan the room, you have a certain amount of information that's coming to your brain. And that gives you, a fairly flat image of what's going on. And if you switch to the other hand and, have the other eye perceive this information, once again, you have information that's fairly flat. So you could sort of think about this eye, the information that's collected by this eye, as a set A, and the other one as set B. But when you actually put that information together and combine it, what you are able to perceive is now depth, which was information that was neither in A nor in B. And to me, that was fascinating because it really highlights this idea that when we look at a particular situation, or we look at trying to measure data from different angles or different perspectives, when we start putting these together, what we are essentially thinking about is, how does that concept of depth now come into this merged data set? And what does that mean? Because the logical type of depth might be different to the logical type of the information by A or B. And so how are we now reframing that information to tell us a story about what's happening? How is the different perception or the way that that information is coded differently giving us further information? And what does that say about human rights? So, this sort of lends itself really well to this idea that the Batesons, and Nora Bateson, who is the president of the International Bateson Institute, talk about this concept called transcontextuality, where we're not just looking at information or data through a single context, and some would prefer to look at it through multiple contexts, right? But what we're interested in is, looking at this information through many contexts, looking at the data through a societal context, and I've listed a few here, a media context, an economic context, a financial context. What does this mean from a technological context? How does it fit in with the environmental context, the health context? And there's a whole bunch. But what's really important here too is, how do these kind of work together? So how does this data from a societal context affect the data from a media context? So it's the same information, but now we're bringing this level of transcontextuality. And you can see that it's a really complex issue, right? Because the mere collection of data is decontextualizing information. So how are we texturizing that context back into that information? Is it even possible? So Nora came up with this idea of warm data. And I've put a definition here for you, which might be interesting. So she says that warm data is information about the interrelationships that connect elements of a complex system. And this is the kind of information that's always shifting, always changing. And it's, you can't really capture it because there are many contexts around that. So you can't really pin it down. And so the thinking here now is, how do we use that kind of information to inform how we build our analytics and how we think about our models and how we design our algorithms? How do we think about how those pieces get put together and give us a richer perspective of what's going on? So she says that, warm data isn't meant to replace or diminish, more traditional data sets, but it's kind of meant to keep certain types of data sets warm with that nest of relations intact. So really addressing, this problem around decontextualizing of information. So how do we sort of, keep those interrelationships, keep the integrity of those interrelationships? And what she did was she developed, and the International Bateson Institute developed these processes called warm data labs. And what they essentially are group processes where people are able to sort of bring their own subjective views, experiences together, and reflect on a particular statement through multiple contexts. So we went through that list earlier in the slides around, the different contexts, but how does information sort of shape and shift across those different contexts? And what does that mean? And so this particular process is really a sense-making process. And so there's a lot of literature out there around, the limitations of our human capability to make sense of information, and how, once we reach a certain threshold, too much information is just too much and we can't make sense of what's going on. But what the International Bateson Institute sort of really taps into is increasing that threshold of sense making by adding different contexts so that people are able to see patterns across different contexts and better make sense of the information that they receive. And this is going to be kind of useful when we start thinking about the augmentation of human information, or what we usually refer to as tacit knowledge, and big data insights, and what the predictive analytics that AI is able to deliver. So another provocation for you, I want to ask the question, what is knowledge? And where is it stored? Where is the knowledge in music, in language, in context, in art, learning? What about DNA? The innate ability of birds to be able to build a nest without being taught how to do that or being given that knowledge. So, where does that knowledge come from? And how is that knowledge being used today to inform the decisions that we make and, our organizational products? How does that knowledge come together? So this is a kind of a play on humans in the loop, and I like to sort of now think about it as humans in the soup, because what we're doing here isn't just having a human as part of a chain, a linear chain or a circular chain or a system or a process. What we want to do is, really address human ingenuity and the warm data that humans bring into the picture, their tacit knowledge, their ability to make sense across many contexts, and how do we then, put that together. So I love this quote by Kevin Kelly. He says, there are more possible ideas, experiences than there are ways to combine neurons in the brain. Memory then must organize itself in some way to accommodate more possible thoughts than it has room to store. And so we have yet to really tap into the human potential of how we see patterns and how we think about information. And, there's a lot of discussion here around, digital transformation and humans losing jobs and the socioeconomic reasons for why humans then need to be part of that process. But what's missing from that dialogue is that, there are some things that we are really good at. And I'm not just talking about creativity. It is that contextualizing piece. And so that is the hidden element in all of this. How do we use humans to bring along that context-making piece, or that transcontextuality, into this conversation, so that organizations don't waste, millions of dollars. And McKinsey has gotten a report of, how much money is actually being wasted by organizations during digital transformations, because the KPIs that are met and are, recorded don't really have an indicative measure for this tacit kind of knowledge. And, it's really hard to be able to measure the level of augmentation between human information and technical information. So, how do we think about the contextualization of this information? So I wanted to mention this contrast between the way machines kind of function and the way humans think. And this is sort of, bordering on that biology kind of space. But essentially, we're continually learning through relationships and through mutual relationships. And that process of learning, has so much information built in that we may not be able to articulate. And so the real, takeaway from this is that, we could have deep learning, or we could have many algorithms that sort of, go through very many combinations to sort of try and, get better with different data training sets. But, babies and humans, because of that mutuality, because of that ability to contextualize information, are able to do this much quicker. And yes, there are limitations to what humans can do as compared to machines. But what we're really discussing here today is about that contextual piece around that data. Now for a really interesting detour. I want to talk about a story about a 1960s British biochemist and NASA consultant, James Lovelock. And this quest that NASA had back then, around that time, where they actually wanted to send a life leader headed for Mars and Venus to be able to ascertain whether or not there was life on Mars or Venus. And James Lovelock was able to just, use a telescope and, ascertain what sort of what the atmospheric composition was on these planets, and save a lot of money and a lot of technology and a lot of effort through his methods, which correctly concluded that there was no life on Mars and Venus during that analysis. And so the question I want to put here is, we have these incredibly powerful tools, but are organizations just reverting to them because it's what they have and investing a huge amount of resources in this? Or are there other ways where we can tap into other fields and human ingenuity to give us outcomes that could be delivered much quicker and with much less cost? So speaking of cost, that brings us to the cost of computation. And we've just reached a new milestone with GPT-3. We've now sort of reached that billion parameter club. And the issue here for organizations, particularly smaller organizations, is that the cost of being able to sort of run these models is huge. And so how do smaller organizations compete with bigger ones? And now I kind of refer back to that story with James Lovelock and say, are we really tapping into that human piece and that really focusing on the augmentation piece? Or are we solely putting all our eggs into one basket, which is the AI basket? And then there are more costs, right? So it's also the economic costs and the environmental costs. And so again, I'm sort of reframing this and saying, we need to be a bit more mindful about when it is appropriate to use AI and perhaps when it might not be that fruitful. So this is an example that I wanted to touch on as well, and it is taken from the State of AI report 2020, where NLP was actually used to come up with some kind of indicators that were able to assess the ESG performance, which is the environmental, social, and governance performance of various funds, for example. And they did this by scraping, media and news articles. Now, again, when we think about the different contexts that are coming into play, what we have is a media context. And so the question I want to ask is this information at all accurate? And how is this information being shaped by that context piece? Are we looking at it through, a very narrow context? And are there other ways of being able to understand this information? And then ask the, really provocative question, which is, are metrics sufficient? We hear so many stories about metrics washing and how, metrics aren't actually being used to serve the purpose that they were intended for. And so I want to put forward the case of, perhaps having something like a meta-metric, which is, a combination of the more traditional metrics approach, but also taking a systemic, perspective, which goes beyond just that qualitative data perspective, but really understanding how those interrelationships come together in each of these cases. And that kind of brings us to this idea around ethics and what does that mean? Where are we on that journey with ethics? So this VentureBeat report that was put together by Carly Kind looks at the different waves of AI ethics and where we've got to. So we started off with the first wave, which she says is like ethics over law, but that kind of resulted in ethics washing. And then we progressed to the second wave, which is that technical interventions where algorithms are designed to reduce the amount of bias that they have. But the issue with that is that they tend to be really narrow and decontextualized. And so now we're currently in a third wave where communities are now having socio-technical interventions. So things like having regulation around where you can use AI, where you can't use AI. Facial recognition is banned in some places. And what does that mean in terms of surveillance? So it's sort of having that external piece sort of coming in there and working within the system. But I think we have the potential to actually go deeper with this. we have the potential to be able to reframe the issues by looking at those interrelationships and thinking about that augmenting piece and thinking about how do we achieve the same outcomes through different ways, and where is it that we can use AI to its best advantage, and when shouldn't we use it? When is it really risky for organizations, and when is it a waste of money? And so that sort of takes us full circle to that sense-making piece again, because humans now have to tap into this ability to make sense around, what they can and can't do across different contexts. So here's the good news and the bad news. The bad news is that the research seems to indicate that having a deontological AI ethics approach, so frameworks and guidelines, actually don't bring about much change in the human decision space, which is really disappointing. But what is interesting is that a combination, and there's research showing that a combination of the deontological ethics and virtue ethics, which is again bringing that subjectivity piece and bringing that sense-making piece back to individuals and organizations, and that culture piece, can bring about that change. And so I picked this quote for you today, which is, ethics, deontological AI ethics should be augmented with an approach oriented towards virtue ethics. Ethics is then no longer understood as a tick box exercise, but as a project of advancing personalities, changing attitudes, and strengthening responsibilities. So again, really touching on those, those transcontextual elements that humans bring to the picture. So I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. What I really want you to get from this is this idea that information is a lot more than what we gather and collect. And to really pay attention, to the rigor and the nature of the information that we collect, and how perception plays a huge role in that. And think about that information across very many contexts, because the more contexts you can cover, the more robust your model and your results will be. And I want to put to you that we need both. We need that warm data and that cold data piece. And essentially, what we want to do is sort of consider that entire picture together, so that then we can sort of look beyond the data and come up with solutions that are regenerative. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you all. I will be putting together a workshop on this material that will go into a bit more depth on each of these topics, and the issues and case studies of what's been happening. So if you're interested, please go to the Eventbrite site and register. And the other thing is, these slides will be available on my company ThemeSite's LinkedIn page. So yeah. Thanks for that. Just to give you the references. And now I might go to the Slido and see if there's any questions. So there's a question here around, we want to project a better versions of ourselves to people AI. Could we use that data in making an algorithm to lead to actualization of that image in reality? That's a great question. And so what I want to say here is, it's making better versions of ourselves. That's a really hard thing to do. And I think part of that, part of addressing those issues around bias in society and how that's all baked in, is to really understand those issues outside that AI algorithmic space, again, from a transcontextual lens. The classic example being, we had the pandemic, and we still have this pandemic, and what appears to be a health issue is affecting the economic system. It's affecting our education system. It's affecting our transportation system. It's affecting our trade. And so you can see that like a single shock in one system sort of like ripples out across to the other systems. And while that may seem obvious after the fact, the question I want to ask here when it comes to these algorithms, like you say, is, is it ever possible to collect that much data that is also subjective and across all those contextual pieces together, which again is an abstraction of reality, to be able to get better insights into that? Or is it actually easier for humans to be able to sort of make sense of that from a transcontextual lens, and then use those insights to develop better metrics, better algorithms, and where we actually understand those linkages and those interrelationships and how they come into play? So are there any more questions, or are we good to go? All right, so I think we're done in terms of the questions. If anyone has any other further questions or would like to catch up on Zoom, I will be there. So thanks so much, everyone, and goodbye.